Hi, a very good morning to everyone. I am Pei from the Culture Academy, and I'll be your MC for today's webinar. For the benefit of those who are joining us for the first time, this is welcome to the Culture Academy's third online edition of our In Conversation With series. Our In Conversation With series offer an online platform for the arts and culture sector leaders and professionals and administrators to come together to also share and present a new aspect of their work and insights. This allows for more interesting discussions and also cross-pollination of ideas and sharing of our best practices. And today, we are very pleased to have with us Ms. Hwee, Chief Executive Officer of the National Heritage Board. We have also Dr. Zhigang, Director of the Shanghai Museum, and Ms. Harger, Executive Director of the Art Science Museum, who will be sharing their views and insights on the topic of opening doors to a new normal, challenges and opportunities, a very relevant topic in these unusual times. Well, this session will be moderated by Ms. Clarissa Oon. She's the Head of Communications and Content at the Esplanade Theatres by the Bay. Once again, please feel free to post your questions under the Q&A function anytime, and our speakers will be able to also address them during the Q&A session. For simultaneous translation, please be reminded to go to the interpretation icon at the top or the bottom of your screen, and you can select your preferred channel that you wish to listen in. Without further ado, I'll now hand the time over to our moderator, Ms. Clarissa Oon, to introduce the speakers. Clarissa, over to you, please.
Good morning, everyone. Today, we are gathered for what promises to be a robust and stimulating discussion on museums and heritage institutions in the new normal. Those of you who know me well will know that other than the theatre, museums are among my favorite places in the world. They're not just a rich repository of art and artifacts, but also ideas, and ideas that connect us not just to the past, but also to our present and future. But at the same time, museums are in a state of transformation. And our three speakers today will talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has led museums to rethink their responsibilities, their functions, and how they reach out to audiences in the new normal, looking at the challenges this has presented, as well as the unexpected opportunities it has posed. Our first speaker, the CEO of Singapore's National Heritage Board, Ms. Hwee, will share what it meant for Singapore's museums and heritage institutions to reopen safely, as it did earlier this month, and how they continue to remain relevant and reach a wider audience through digitalization. She'll also talk about the human resource aspects of the shift in the sense of the new demands on museum professionals having to acquire new skills and experiences. Following her, we'll have our second speaker, the director of the Shanghai Museum, Dr. Zhigang, who will talk about being one of the first museums in the world to reopen, which the Shanghai Museum did in March after being closed for 49 days, and how the museum landscape has changed irrevocably from digitalization to having to reimagine international collaborations. And finally, the executive director of Singapore's Art Science Museum, Ms. Harger, will share about how the experience of being forced to close during the pandemic has led the museum, known for international touring exhibitions bringing together art and technology, to rethink its practice through an online program of virtual tours, talks, and screenings that are cutting edge, globally oriented, and yet also inclusive. She will talk about how this has meant rethinking the job of the curator, going back to its Latin root word curare, which means to take care of in the sense of looking out for the immediate community. So much food for thought. And with that, I present the time to our first speaker, Ms. Chang.
Good morning. I'm very happy to join Clarissa, Dr. Yang, and Honor at this morning's webinar. And I'd like to thank Cultural Academy for inviting me. Well, COVID-19 has really changed practically everything in a very short time. And it has changed the way we live, work, consume, participate in lives and its activities. And the culture sector is not immune. In fact, it's one of the worst hit sectors because we're dependent on visitors, both local and international. And many of our programs are very high touch. So while it's true that some of our content can be consumed in the digital space, but we also know that deep engagements very often is predicated on person-to-person interaction. So how have we had to change the way we work at NHB? Well, I would like to share my thoughts on these three key areas: reopening safely, remaining relevant, rescaling, and re-engaging. So our first priority is, of course, to ensure a safe environment for our staff and for our visitors. Even before we gradually reopened our institutions on 26th June, we were carefully studying how our international counterparts were adapting their daily operational realities to this new normal. For example, Shanghai Museum, which Dr. Yang leads, reopened on 3rd March, one of the first museums reopened, and they've implemented online booking for visitors as well as limited daily visitor numbers. These are very valuable lessons. And although museums in Australia reopened on 2nd June, we saw last week how people in Melbourne had to scale back their daily lives and museum had to close again because of a second wave of infection in the city. So we really have to remain very, very vigilant to avoid such a situation. So to ensure that, we have limited our visitor capacity. We required all visitors to wear masks and stepped up cleaning in public areas. And as an anchor in the sector, NHB has also prepared guidelines to help our Museum Roundtable members to reopen safely. And very importantly, these are really part of the broader national recovery efforts. And we have to remain very nimble and respond very quickly to new information. Well, it's not just a cliche, that despite our circumstances, there are real opportunities for innovation. So in terms of content presentation, we are experimenting with contactless interactives. And we have also put up QR codes to replace touch screens so that we can safely deliver more information about our contents in our galleries. Actually, there's also great potential for innovative practices which enhance the safety of our museum visitors. I think, take for example, you can see on the screen, this simple modification to a protective shield of the Aarhus Museum of Art in Denmark. It keeps staff and visitors safe, but it's also playful and memorable. But even after we have opened our doors and put in place all these safety measures, how do we encourage public to visit? Well, this question of relevance is not a new one, but it has certainly taken on a sort of different tone in the context of COVID-19. When museums around the world closed, there was a mass migration to the digital space. Our museum in Singapore, likewise, created digital content and pushed them online quickly. Overnight, our audience became global. This presents new opportunities for us to engage with new audience segments who couldn't otherwise visit our museums, such as the overseas Singaporeans. So take, for example, Singapore Heritage Festival. This was just concluded a few weeks ago. And for the very first time, we conducted all the programs of this signature festival online. Of course, there were challenges, like the rest of the creative sector. We couldn't conduct filming over the circuit breaker, and our work time has been compressed tremendously. But based on public feedback and comments, we are very heartened that our audience connected with content. Ramadan also fell within this period of the circuit breaker, and indeed it was a very different Ramadan this year for our Muslim community. So we decided to introduce this Ramadan Together, a social initiative which serves to bring the community together virtually. So online events like Mass Iftar, Raya recipe sharings, community karaoke session of the popular Raya tunes were conducted virtually through live streaming. But in the long run, we'll be closely integrating physical and digital experiences. And I'm not referring only to digital engagement in the galleries, but also beyond, right to the homes of our audience. And we have learned that digital offering and engagement have to be curated right at the beginning, right at the outset, as part of the exhibition, pre, during, and after, and not as an afterthought. And we want it to be a teaser that brings the visitors to the physical exhibition. Additionally, we have also rolled out a survey to better understand the consumption patterns and expectations in the digital realm. We are still analyzing the data, although preliminarily, it seems that we have reached new audiences through our digital content. And beyond audience engagement, the use of technology and digitalization is also very critical in improving our organizational processes and efficiency. And the use of data analytics, is very crucial to enhance our understanding of our audience. I think one point I would like to note is that COVID-19 really has allowed us to do what CEOs, CTOs have not been able to achieve all these years in terms of the use of technology. So the key now is really to lock in these gains that we've made during the most compressed time and for us to continue to build on this foundation. Beyond the immediate pivot to digital, we also had to move very quickly to collect artifacts that represent this moment of history. The museum of today collect for the museums of tomorrow. And together with National Archives, National Museum of Singapore, NMS, launched a public call for objects, photos, videos, and journal entries which reflect life in Singapore during this pandemic. And the exhibition Home Truly, which will open in October at NMS, will also touch on this crisis. So NHB is also reviewing our medium and long-term priorities. And across institutions, we're also reviewing our exhibition calendar to present content that will resonate with Singaporeans. In a time of crisis, it's important for the museum to lift the spirit, unite the society, forge solidarity, promote well-being, and ultimately enable healing. Therefore, our exhibitions have to enable dialogue and relate meaningfully to Singaporeans. So to keep a lookout for our exhibition calendar in the next few years, we'll also continue to engage closely with communities and the public in content development and program design. Of course, we also continue with our international collaboration, like we're really looking forward to our traveling exhibition to Shanghai Museum in the coming months. But even before COVID-19 hit us, our museums had stepped up collaboration with other museums and organizations in the wider creative and culture sector, as well as institutes of higher learning. ACM announced in December that the next phase of our development also focused on decorative arts to highlight the connection between ancient civilizations. But they also plugged in closely to contemporary evolution of culture. For example, ACM has partnered the Textile and Fashion Federation Singapore to encourage local fashion designers to draw from our heritage for inspiration in their contemporary designs. LaSalle is also a very strong partner for many of our programs. So this collaboration are important for securing the place of heritage in the public's mind. And how heritage remains relevant is a constant negotiation within the communities and between the different groups. Finally, I'd just like to speak very briefly about our building up our capabilities, and not just within NHB, but also in our wider network of stakeholders. To manage this new paradigm, our staff have had to build up new capabilities in a very, very short time. For example, our curators have shared that they have had to learn how to purposefully build experiences for digital audiences. The deep specialization of our curators are always valuable, but COVID-19 has also highlighted the need for diversification of skill sets, even among the specialists. So this diversity of capabilities will help our sector to be more nimble and more responsive to changes. So as part of the Arts and Culture Resilience Package, NHB has introduced grants to help support the digitalization efforts for the Museum Roundtable members. we have established communities of practice, and also regularly conduct webinars just like this one to share knowledge, to discuss issues that's relevant to museum practitioners, Singapore, ASEAN, and sometimes even beyond. So I strongly believe that it is really through this kind of partnership, both local and international, that NHB can tide through this very tough period, because we're all in it together. So thank you, and I look forward to the dialogue ahead. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Yang Zhigang, the director of the Shanghai Museum, to address us. Dr. Yang.
新加坡的各位同行，还有各位朋友，大家上午好。我是上海博物馆的杨志刚。我发言的题目是艰难时刻，博物馆定有作为。2020年初，新冠疫情突如其来，它给人类社会带来前所未有的冲击。这一点呢，刚才这个新加坡的文物局张局长也提到了，我们都是感同身受的。那么这样的一个冲击呢，导致了全球范围内博物馆纷纷临时关闭。上海博物馆是比较早的关闭博物馆的，在经历了从1月24日到3月12日，总共49天的闭馆之后，那么上博又成为最早重新开门迎客的博物馆之一。我们知道，新加坡公立博物馆在7月，也就是这个月的第2周开始逐步开放。那么7月，也已开放的还有法国的卢浮宫。那么全球范围看呢，美国大都会博物馆将在下个月的29号，要重新开馆迎客。陆陆续续的这个全球的博物馆开始恢复，但是呢，现在预测等这一轮疫情过后，估计会有相当一部分的博物馆是不能再开放了。这是受到了疫情方方面面的冲击造成的一个很不好的一个结果。那么在这样的一个背景下面，新加坡文化学院策划组织这场连线，我就觉得显得特别的重要。我也非常的欣赏，也很乐意借这个机会和大家分享上海博物馆在疫情期间的一些做法和体会。我要特别提到1月23号这一天，上海博物馆从早上到晚上一天内向社会接连发布了3个公告。首先，我们根据对前几天疫情的研判和观众调查，我们发布了第1个公告。这个里面包括了我们提出要限流、测温、佩戴口罩、保持社交距离、避免人群集聚等预防措施。到下午的时候，我们又发出了第2个公告。这个第2个公告里面，我们就提醒上海博物馆将视疫情发展而随时可能闭馆，因为我们感觉到了疫情非常的迅猛。到了晚上，我们又发了第3个公告，我们明确第2天，那第2天正好是中国的农历大年夜，也是春节长假的第1天，我们要闭馆。这是出于我们对公众和对我们博物馆馆员的安全的一种考量。闭馆期间，上海博物馆部分干部员工坚守岗位，确保场馆正常运维，并落实每一项防控措施。在国家和上海市的相关要求基础上，上海博物馆拟定了切合本馆实际情况的防控操作手册。其他人员呢，则居家办公。 保证博物馆基本工作不断不乱。在我们馆领导之间，在馆领导和中层干部之间，还有各个部门内部，大家都建立了很多的群微信群我们通过这个 WeChat 保持信息的畅通，从而保持我们的工作平稳有序，这样呢能够高效的来应对疫情。我们从春节开始整合了大量的数字资源，借助网络与观众保持联系和互动，在云端继续传播博物馆文化。那么我们看到了，整个中国博物馆界都在网上纷纷行动起来，所以呢，出现了一些有关于云的一些新的概念，比如说云观展这个云端会议等等等等，这是新的一个现象。3月23号，我们重新恢复开放，上海博物馆进一步调整完善防控措施，努力做到防控与发展两手抓两手赢，各项工作很快的步入正轨，并且已经推出3个临时展览。到下个月还有再下个月，就是8月份、9月份，上海博物馆还将推出2个临时展览，其中一个，我想新加坡的同行也一定非常的关注，就是新加坡的亚洲文明博物馆和上海博物馆合作的，黑石号沉船出水文物的一个展览。现在我们正在紧锣密鼓的推进当中。虽然疫情给国际文化交流影响非常的大，但是呢，上海博物馆始终和国际博物馆同行心连心，在信函往来中，大家讨论现实，展望未来。我们还应邀向一批国际知名博物馆分享了抗疫的经验和做法，我们向大概国际上的8、9个知名博物馆提供了我们英文版的我们的防疫的手册，还有重新开馆的应该注意的事项。那么在这一段时间里面呢，我们也参与了上海我们当地政府推出的促进复工复产的活动。我们参加了55购物节，66这个上海夜生活节，我们推出了一批新的文创产品，大家在那个PPT 上面可以看到，我们推出的文创产品受到了市民和观众的广泛的欢迎，这个大家反响非常的热烈。我还要向各位同行和朋友汇报的是，7月15号上海博物馆组织了一次云上对话，是全球博物馆人一起参与的，全球8个国家和地区的同行，这个里面呢包括馆长，包括部门的主任，包括策展人，他们主要都是从事东亚艺术研究的专家。我们在线上有一个3个多小时的一个会谈，起到了非常好的一个沟通的一个效果，体现了我们这个云上对话的主题就是博物馆的力量。我觉得现在通过网络是凝聚和彰显博物馆力量的一个很重要的渠道。今天新加坡文物局、新加坡学院组织这项活动，我觉得也是对博物馆力量的一个很好的一个体现。最近半年多来，我们体会到，面对疫情，要把观众和员工的健康始终放在第一位。那么同样重要的还有，在这样一个艰难的时刻，馆要肩负起新的使命。怎么说呢？就是说在这样的一个时刻， 我们要以文化的力量，以我们专业的能力来凝聚人心，抚慰人心，重振人心。如果我们的市民感觉到博物馆是开放的，而且你到博物馆来是很安全的，你在博物馆里面可以很放心的参观和交流，这就好比是黑夜里面的一个灯塔，会温暖很多的人心，给我们社会注入一种信心和力量。所以我今天发表的这个讲话的题目就是
感谢杨馆长. Thank you, Dr. Yang. And now I'd like to hand the time over to Ms. Honor Harger, Executive Director of the Art Science Museum. Honor?
Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, firstly, a warm thank you to my friend Thang Him at Culture Academy and all of her colleagues, Pei Jun and the team at Culture Academy for the invitation to be with you today. It's an honor. My short talk, as you can see here, is entitled Dark Clouds and Silver Linings, and it tells the story of how my institution has navigated the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm the director of this place here, Art Science Museum. We're the institution in Singapore that explores the intersection between art, science, culture, and technology. 6 months ago, our institution was a hive of activity in one of Singapore's busiest areas, Marina Bay. We welcomed an average of about 2,800 people to the museum at this time, at the beginning of the year, and they came to see 2 exhibitions which explored the future. One imagined how climate change might shape the next 2 centuries, and the other was full of immersive installations by the Art and Technology Collective Team Lab. Visitors, young and old, came to the museum to catch a glimpse of the future and to learn through physical interaction and social participation. Late last year, we even welcomed our 2 millionth visitor to our permanent exhibition, Future World. Everything seemed rosy. But then the pandemic struck. In a matter of 2 short months, our reality completely changed. From early February, our museum began temperature screening for every visitor who came. We introduced safe distancing measures, and our curators and conservators had to adjust to a very different way of working in the galleries. The closure of our borders, plus the strict safe distancing laws that Singapore passed to manage the pandemic, cut our visitation by 89%. Our normally lively galleries fell silent. And then in April, like so many other museums, we closed as Singapore went into its own version of lockdown, the circuit breaker. As we contemplated a future in a world racked by the pandemic, it seemed clear that everything that we knew about how to run a museum, from staging exhibitions to running education programs to setting budgets and communicating with audiences, was no longer valid. We had some dark days trying to figure out how it's possible economically and culturally to run a museum for only 11% of the audience that we once had. We realized that we were going to have to say goodbye to some things that we had held dear. But there was no time to mourn. Within 2 weeks of the circuit breaker, we spun up an online program that we call Art Science at Home. It enables visitors to experience the museum's programs from the comfort of their own home. In this program, we're responding directly to the COVID-19 pandemic by programming conferences that explore uncertain feelings towards the future, workshops that give families and children learning activities to do at home, and performances and films by artists who were also in lockdown, which enables us to support our local arts community at a time where that's urgently needed. Art Science at Home became our primary public program. It's a new chapter in our evolution, and perhaps an illustration of one way for museums to work more sustainably during the pandemic era. With the pandemic forcing us to work from home at a different pace, we also noticed things that we hadn't been paying attention to before. We started listening to members of our community who'd been marginalised and kept out of sight. We heard stories from unexpected places that we felt needed to be told. So Art Science at Home has hosted conferences featuring people with disabilities, talking about how the move to online working has created new opportunities for them. We're currently screening the first film made by a migrant worker in Singapore, Salary Day by R. Madhavan. And we've just launched an education program which is aimed at children called Let's Talk About. It encourages gratitude, empathy and thankfulness for the less appreciated and less visible members of our community. We started with a session where children made thank you cards for our migrant worker friends from home. And we continued last week with a session that focused on loneliness amongst elderly friends and family members. Our museum and many others in Singapore opened to the public again earlier this month. But the new reality that we find ourselves working within in the wake of COVID-19 means that our on-site visitation is going to be dramatically reduced by safe distancing and border restrictions for the foreseeable future. This is certainly worrying, but there's been surprising silver linings that we hadn't expected. We find that we're listening more. We're reflecting on how we can amplify voices of storytellers in our more marginalised communities. We know that our role as museum professionals goes beyond being custodians of iconic buildings. So we're gravitating towards the original meaning of the word curator, which in Latin means to care. Perhaps building back better after COVID-19, opening our doors to a new normal, means curating in that original sense of the word, caring for each other and also for our community. One of the ways that we think we can do that at Art Science Museum is presenting alternative and different visions of the future. Our current show, 2219, is set in a world dramatically transformed by climate change 2 centuries from now. It enables visitors to confront that future. As we all face the crisis of COVID-19, this type of futuring work feels ever more important. The writer René Denfeld has said of people in crisis, I found that the people who survive, the people who end up thriving even, are the people who have the power of imagination. If you think about it, imagination is actually a radical act, because if you have an imagination, you can imagine yourself in a different future. Thank you.
Thank you, Honor. So now that we've heard from all our 3 speakers, I'd like to open it to the floor for questions. So please keep your questions coming in. We have 2 questions currently in the Q&A. If you go to the little box at the bottom of the screen, Q&A, you can start to key it in, and yep, it's pretty instantaneous. And you can also vote for the questions that you would like the speakers to answer. I will kick things off. Maybe I'd like to ask all 3 speakers, I mean, as cultural leaders, leaders of institutions with staff who look to you for direction and guidance, what has been the one thing that has kept you lying awake at night? You know, if you had to single out one thing that worries you the most in this whole disruptive time of the last few months, what would that be, and how have you sort of tried to take steps to address that challenge? Yeah, any one of you? Maybe Ms. Chang, since I see that you're smiling. What's the one thing that has kept you lying awake at night, during this time, and how have you sort of tried to address it, as a cultural leader?
Well, I think at this time, very clearly is health and safety. Health and safety of the staff, health and safety of the visitors. I think that is really right at the center of everything we do now. And especially now with the reopening, we see the resurgence of infection in many other parts of the world. I think we really, really have to maintain our vigilance. And as I mentioned, the other very important issue is how to maintain our relevance, both in the short term and as well in the medium and longer term. And we really have to take care of our staff because it's a time of uncertainty and it's a lot of disruption to their daily routine. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen next. So I think it's very important for us to take not just a whole of institution, whole of NHB, but also a whole of museum sector and whole of Singapore, even the whole of international global community kind of perspective, because we are really all in it together and it's a very challenging times. And if we can really share with each other, we'll realize that we are not alone. And there are many things like what Honor mentioned, what Dr. Yang mentioned. It's really a lot of a silver lining. And it's really how to instill the kind of confidence that is, we can really harness this and turn this into opportunities. And I've already seen that. As I mentioned, I don't think I'll be able to encourage and motivate a kind of digitalization within this short and compressed time. And we have made really a lot of inroads, and many of the things can be consolidated, and they've put us in a very, very strong footing going forward. So it is a temporary disruption, and I feel that the top priority now is maintain the health and safety and harness and bring everyone together to confront it, overcome it, and to emerge stronger, both as an individual institution as well as a whole community coming together.
Thank you, Ms. Chang. Honor, would you like to share what has been, the thing that's been weighing most in your mind over the last few months?
It's definitely the safety of my team. That's the thing that keeps me awake up at night. We run public spaces, and public spaces right now carry an element of risk. And I care about my team. I care about our visitors deeply, and so trying to create the safest possible conditions which enable us to open is number one concern, and everything else pales by comparison. But I guess the other kind of sleepless night topic for me is that question that I posed in the talk: how do we run institutions for a fraction of the visitors that we once had? In our case, it's an 89% reduction on our pre-COVID levels. That number varies from institution to institution. It depends on how much floor space you have in many cases. But the reality is that while our borders remain closed and therefore our institutions are open to our local residents only, our visitation is going to be dramatically constrained. And a big headache for all of us, whether we're in the public sector or the private sector, is how do we create a economically sustainable institution for those new conditions? I'm not sure anyone has any answers yet, but that is certainly the cause of many sleepless nights.
Dr. Yang, what has been your biggest worry running a museum in China?
对，这个刚才两位嘉宾介绍了他们馆的一些情况。上海博物馆同样的，非常关注观众和员工的这个安全。另外呢，我们也特别的关心我们文物的安全，因为在展厅里面，这个文物的安全还是要加以 重视的。我们在恢复开放的时候呢，是有选择性的。那些展厅里面有裸制文物的比较多的展厅，我们没有开放。少部分的展厅，里面有一些裸制的文物，我们都用玻璃或者其他的材料把它包裹起来。为什么呢？因为这些文物，裸制的文物，万一以后观众里面发现几天以后追溯的话，说它是有健康问题的，那么这些文物都要有消毒，那么消毒对文物会带来影响的。所以呢，我们把裸制的文物都把它包裹了起来，让文物处在一个相对安全的一个环境里面。另外，我们的展厅开放的时候呢，每天间隔2个小时都要进行消毒，展厅里面展柜上面的玻璃都要消毒，凡是我们观众手能够碰到的地方都要消毒。我们选择了用酒精，不是用消毒液，因为酒精对于文物保护的效果会比较好，不会带来一些损害，所以我们有很充分的一些考虑。另外呢，我们还要处理一些因为突发疫情而带来的一些问题。这主要是指什么呢？是我们在1月份的时候有2个国际合作的展览，一个是来自巴黎高等美术学院的叫做美术的诞生一个油画展，是巴黎高美的他们的收藏。那么因为疫情，这个展览就被迫终止了。终止了以后呢，本来我们很乐观，以为法方会有他们的专业人员到上海博物馆来进行策展，结果法国的疫情也相继起来了，所以那段时间我们不停地在制定方案，1天一变，后来是半天一变，最后来是1个小时方案要变一变，最后在法国实行全国闭关的情况的前面1夜，法方派来了一个专家到达了上海，就他一个人和我们团队合作，完成了对这些文物的点胶和打包，最后赶在国际航班还能够起飞的情况下面，我们把其中的文物送上了飞机，这个非常的难得，其中1环扣着1环，这是疫情期间非常难的出现的一个情况。另外一个展览呢，是我们上海博物馆和日本唐招提寺合作的，是鉴真的唐代一个高僧叫鉴真文物，还有这个唐招提寺70年代有日本一个著名的画家他画的格扇画。这个展览呢，在疫情之后3月23号我们开馆的时候，恢复开馆的时候又重新开放了。为什么？因为这个展览里面提到了鉴真和尚说的8个字，叫山川异域，风月同天。这个8个字呢，在疫情爆发以后，日本方面寄给中国的那些抗疫的物资上面都写上去了这8个字，山川异域，风月同天。就是说，虽然我们处在不同的这个国土上面，但是我们是在同一个天地之下，我们有共同的追求，有共同的情感，共同的对于真善美的追求。那么这个展览重新恢复开放以后，我们把这8个字放大放在展厅里面，吸引了更多的观众来进行参观。这个成为中国和日本文化交流里面的一个新的一个佳话。那么同样，这批文物到了展厅要关闭的时候，也有一个文物回运的问题。现在 我们将其中的善化顺利的通过船运已经运回了日本。但是另外还有一批就是鉴真文物，现在我们把它很好的进行了点胶、打包，收藏在我们的库房里面，绝对保证这批展品的安全。我们希望疫情能够早日的缓解或者结束，这样我们就可以把这批文物安全的送回日本。总之，这个疫情给国际文化交流带来了非常大的冲击。接下去，博物馆，我觉得我们还是要加强国际合作，但是国际合作有它的不确定性。我们今后的工作就是怎么来增强，用我们的工作来破解各种国际交流里面的不确定性。所以我们的工作是更加难了，就是我们今天这个谈话的主题这个既有 challenge 又有 opportunity， 我们怎么来回应这个挑战和机遇同在？好，谢谢。
谢谢杨馆长。Right, we've got a good range of questions right now. Some of them deeply philosophical and others very practical, but something that we need to confront. So I'm going to ask a question which has been posed by Hwee Xiao on digitalization. I mean, something all arts institutions we've had to pivot to digital channels to reach out to our audiences. But at the same time, this has posed questions. So we are creating wonderful digital content, some of it in abundance to engage audiences during this period of limited visitorship. But could, you know, the opposite effect result from this, that we are so successful that audiences will instead, you know, form new habits of encountering artworks via virtual platforms instead of, you know, visiting the actual museum? What are the consequences of that for museums? And secondly, what are some considerations for creating digital content that, you know, can perhaps avoid those kinds of adverse counterproductive effects that will maybe entice audience to go to the museum to see the real thing instead? Yeah. Your thoughts on these? Honor, would you like to go first? I mean, since you know you've of the experiences with art science at home.
Sure. I don't think that the online experience replaces the physical encounter of the museum at all. I think of these as two very discrete and complementary kind of spaces of engagement. I'm not sure that the most successful kind of digital kind of interventions and engagements during the various lockdowns have been the attempts to recreate the physical experience online. That tends to, you know, kind of almost highlight how special and multi-sensorial kind of physical encounters with museums actually are. It's a poor substitution, I think, when we try and kind of recreate a sort of a physical encounter online. What really works, at least in our case, when we're thinking about creating programs for the online space, is to think about an online audience and how they are specific and different and unique compared to an on-site audience, and program for them. And that means programming different stories, and programming different artists' work and telling different stories about science than we would if we were kind of thinking about our physical spaces. The best curators, I think, always take the spatial context of their environment into account when they're putting together exhibitions or programs. And the same is the case when we're thinking about the internet and digital spaces. They're unique and they're specific. And we as institutions need to work out how to curate and to engage audiences specific to those environments. If we do that, there's no fear of, I think, kind of sort of pulling audiences away from our public spaces. Our buildings are still unique, and the encounters that our audiences have with our collections, our artifacts and our artworks are utterly unique, and digital can't recreate that. in my view.
We ask, now that, I mean, Art Science at Home is running parallel together with the live exhibition experience now that the museum has opened. Could you give an example of how, something on Art Science at Home serves to direct the audience to the live exhibition, or is it completely separate?
We see them as quite distinct. So we're not intending for Art Science at Home to direct visitors to the physical site, because our audiences there are different. It's a local and an international audience. Some of our audience online are people who can't visit, and that's not just because they're not based in Singapore. It might be because they have a disability that makes moving around difficult. They come from a community that doesn't feel welcomed in museums, or they may have economic or financial constraints about moving around. So we don't see kind of Art Science at Home as a tool for promoting our physical kind of site. That's our marketing program, and of course that's different and distinct kind of from Art Science at Home.
Okay, thanks, Honor. Dr. Yang?
Sorry, yeah.
Oh, Ms. Chang. Sorry, Ms. Chang, go ahead.
First, I can just jump in. I think I definitely echo Honor that they are complementary. And as I mentioned during my presentation, I feel that it's very important that careful design is very critical. Take, for example, our coming exhibition on Home Truly. We really want to have a different public engagement mode, more sort of online contribution and discussion, and leading to the physical exhibition. So I think it has to be very carefully curated right at the outset, so that it's the pre-exhibition leading to the exhibition itself, and also the post-exhibition. And it's really like a omni-channel. It's almost like e-commerce, with online, offline kind of integration. We are still in very, very early days. We are learning along the way, but I think that is really quite critical. But I do agree with Honor that I don't think it's possible to totally replace the kind of tactile, the kind of physical. And I think one of the constraints of our current virtual tour, virtual exhibition is still very 2D. And of course, with the advancement of technology, we can, of course, think in terms of how to make it more 3D, how to incorporate even more technology, VR, immersive environment. But as we may, I think it can never totally replace the kind of physical contact. But I think it actually opens up opportunities for different public engagement mode, and that can help enrich, inform the exhibition, and how to do it in such a way that is complementary, how to do it in such a way you actually draw more footfall to the exhibition. But of course, this is our aspiration, this is our desire, and it really depends on how well we can execute that. And we are really right in the midst of doing that, and we really hope that we'll learn a lot from this experiment and this process.
Thank you, Ms. Chang. Dr. Yang?
好，我非常同意刚才哈格馆长和张局长提到的，对博物馆来讲，线上和线下这两个方面是相辅相成的。那么这一次疫情呢，因为情况特殊，给线上的利用，提出了一个新的挑战。应该说，大家都有很好的一个回应。上海博物馆在闭馆后不久，我们就开始整合我们数字资源，然后在线上一个集体的呈现包括我们的一些虚拟的展厅、一些展厅的导览，还有其他的有关博物馆的资源。那么再过了一段时间以后，我们又扩大了线上和观众的互动的内容，包括我们通过一些直播活动，比如说5月18号518是国际博物馆日，我们就进行了这个现场的直播，我们请专家来进行导览，1个小时甚至1个小时多，对我们的 展厅的内容，还有我们的文物的这个重要性，它的历史的、科学的、艺术的价值，还有我们陈列的一些新的手段，进行了全方位的介绍。我也做过直播，感觉和观众互动，我们多了更多的这个方式。博物馆和观众之间的距离没有因为疫情而拉远，而是越来越近了。另外，我们还通过网络来传播我们的文创产品。我做过一个天猫的直播活动。天猫是阿里巴巴下面一个很重要的一个平台。上海博物馆有很好的文创产品，以前呢都是在实体店里面进行售卖，这一次我们就到网上天猫，通过线上我记得有一次上海博物馆和国内8家博物馆合作，那一次观众量就是在天猫线上看我们直播的、购买文物的达到了700万人。这是一个非常好的对于博物馆文化传播的手段。另外呢，我们还有一些讲座在现场转播，然后我们又把它录像，现在准备放到一个叫上海博物馆云课堂的地方，我们的观众随时都可以去点击，去可以收看。所以我觉得呢，疫情既是冲击，又给博物馆如何用好互联网提供了一个很大的一个空间。这也是倒逼，倒逼是博物馆发展的一个很重要的要去把握好的一个机会。
Thanks, Dr. Yang. You mentioned Alibaba, which segues nicely to a question from Hakping of SSO, addressed to you, Dr. Yang. With so many large and famous technology companies in China, how has the recent digitalization moves changed China's relationships with these, changed Chinese museums' relationships with these big technology companies? Have you been able to leverage on them for collaborations and such like?
好的，上海博物馆呢，现在正在寻找科技实力更加强的合作伙伴。以前上海博物馆呢，也有一些公司给我们提供科技支撑，但是我们觉得这个科技支撑，我们现在更看重的是它要具有一种原创性。那么这些原创性呢，能力一般是一些大的公司比如说阿里巴巴，比如说腾讯等等。所以我们现在在寻找新的合适的伙伴，来推进上海博物馆的数字化的这样的一个项目。那么我们中国国内呢，是把数字化的项目称之为叫智慧化，在博物馆呢是叫智慧博物馆。所以我们现在在建设上海博物馆的东馆，我们的目标就说是要建一个智慧博物馆。今后东馆建成以后，我们现在的人民广场的馆舍，我们叫本馆，本馆也要进行改造，我们也要通过智慧化提升它的服务能级。所以我觉得寻找好的、强有力的数字化的这种力量强的公司，是我们现在要去面对的一个问题。
谢谢杨馆长。Thank you, Dr. Yang. So from the subject of digitalization, let's move to something a bit more philosophical. So there was a question by Wendy Chua that it's encouraging to hear that museums can become more inclusive for marginalized communities. So as we make museums more relevant for the communities, how can we also make art more relevant in a public health crisis so that it can be appreciated for its essential role in society? So I guess the backdrop of this, in Singapore recently, there was a hoo-ha over artists being labeled as non-essential workers in a survey. So at a time like this, how can museums play a role in elevating the role of art, in making society more conscious of the importance of art in the midst of a public health crisis? Ms. Chang?
Yeah, okay. I think this is a very important point. which is why I think during this period, we also want to work very closely with the creative sector. NGS will be having an exhibition that's working very, very closely with the art community. And some of the museum, I think like NMS will be part of this exercise. Even for the heritage realm, it's also very important for us to participate in this, which is why I also mentioned about both NMS as well as ACN will be working very closely with our fashion designer, with our different Singapore brand to support the whole industry and to give a sort of a confidence, you know, to our local industry. And so I think definitely in terms of the whole museum community, in terms of our exhibition calendaring, in terms of our program design, we'll have to take that into consideration. And I'm very glad to say that everyone is stepping up to it. I think Ona has shared that NGS has also will be, I think, launching this program. They call it Novel, I think, and with many sort of satellite venues in different parts of Singapore. I think we really have to sort of rally together. I understand it's created quite a lot of discussion about during these difficult times, how to make sure that culture, heritage, you know, arts remain as essential. And I think it's definitely so for the marginalized community, for the elderly, for the youth. We definitely can play a very powerful, important role. Because it's really through arts, you know, through the different artifacts that can tell different stories and can touch us in a very different way. And I think it's really for us to put our minds together to see how to harness that power, the inherent power. And I think for us in the music community, it's really to provide the kind of platform, the kind of opportunities to bring the people together. But I think we also want to really listen to the community, to the public, to see what else we can do to work in partnership with the whole community to bring it about.
Thanks, Ms. Chang. Honor?
Well, I think one of the ways that institutions can make art more relevant at a time of a public health crisis is to address the public health crisis kind of within our programs and our exhibitions. Harder to do in exhibitions because they take longer to turn around, but easier to do in programs. One of the programs that we in fact presented this week at Art Science Museum Online was a discussion with a group of artists from the UK called Blast Theory, who have made 2 artworks over the past year about pandemics, which now of course appear to be eerily prescient. One of them looked at the SARS kind of epidemic and the vectors of transmission of a disease which is very well known in Singapore. And the other very poignantly looked at the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic and specifically looked at how large-scale public gatherings contributed to the worsening of that pandemic in the States. Those works were made last year, and when you look at them now, it feels as if they have somehow predicted the future that we're living in right now. So being able to, you know, kind of highlight, I guess, the work of artists who are often in some ways early warning kind of systems for, you know, what might happen in the future, can actually be a way of kind of coming to terms with some of the complex emotions that we feel during the uncertain, confusing, and often very distressing times of a public health crisis.
Thank you, Honor. Dr. Yang, do you have any thoughts on this?
我补充一个比较特别的细节，就是说互联网我们的使用，现在我们拓展到了我们的博物馆的策展方面。 前面我们讲到了，因为疫情呢，我们有些展览啊，在布展和策展方面发生了困难。本来应该有博物馆人2个团队合作的，在现场工作的，现在因为来往受到限制，所以呢，我们现在有了线上的这种在指导下的这种策展。比如说我前面提到了，我们和日本唐招提寺合作的那个鉴真文物的展览，因为疫情，日方不能派专家到现场来点验文物，所以呢，我们就通过网络视频，我们一面策展，一面请日方的专家在线上关注，始终关注着每一个细节，有不清楚的地方我们就请教，这样我们就比较顺利的把一个展览把它撤了下来，文物没有受到影响和破坏，大家都很安心，也符合相关的这种博物馆的策展的要求。最近我们又有一个展览是和台湾台湾地区那个叫佛光山，那是星云大师那个开创的一个叫佛陀纪念馆。去年12月呢，我们在佛陀纪念馆办了一个展览，叫海上佛影，是上海博物馆收藏的佛教艺术的这个文物，在佛陀纪念馆展出。这个展出了以后呢，6月份就闭馆了。那么闭馆了以后，这批文物要从展厅撤下来，怎么撤？我们派去了一个专家，很难得的去了一个专家。那么大量的工作也是通过线上完成的。这个专家在现场指导，另外通过网络，我们这边有好几位专家同时指导佛光山的专业人员来策展，这个也是一个很新的一个尝试。我觉得在疫情不确定的情况下面，以后的布展策展可能要借助网络，可能会越来越多。我想补充这么一个细节，这是我们真实遇到的一个问题。
Thank you all to the 3 of you. So we have a question about KPIs, our favorite topic. So I mean, typically, you know, visitorship is the benchmark of success. It's what we measure for museums. But at this period of time, it's inevitable that visitorship will drop for a prolonged period. So how will each of your museums, you know, re-identify success in achieving your museum's vision and mission?
This is one of the most challenging, but even pre-COVID, we have very constant discussion on so-called KPIs and how to look beyond the visitorship number. I think with this COVID, it had really also presented us with good opportunities. We can have more reflection. We will want to undertake more research, and we also want to have take another critical look at the impact of what we do in the society. So beyond the quantitative indicators like visitorship, which is still very important, I always have this discussion of this with my staff, my team, because if we do not have the attendance, if we do not have the digital reach, we are not able to deliver the outcomes that we seek. But this is not the be all and end all. It's complementary. We have to look at both the quantity as well as quality. But as we know, it's extremely difficult to evaluate the social impact. So we are working with CA, and we're working with the different partners to look at the social impact of our programs in our precincts, the festivals. So it's a one stream of work that we are doing. But we mentioned, we talk about the pivot, the digital. So another very important point is the digital reach. Not just the reach, but the engagement and also the more in-depth engagement. So I would say that it's really a combination of a whole portfolio of indicators, both quantitative as qualitative. We also have this heritage impact assessment. actually look at different indicators, different indices, the sense of belonging, the sense of social cohesion at a broader level. But as you can imagine, that we will not be doing it on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis. It will not be meaningful. So we used to do it on a 3-yearly basis, but we are evaluating whether or not we can shorten it to once in 2 years, and to continue to fine-tune the indicator, the index. I'm very pleased to say that it has worked. We've done very well. It has seen a very significant improvement over the last 3 years, but we have to continue to work very hard. And especially now with this COVID-19, we're also thinking very hard on how to fine-tune the instruments. And but I would say that really beyond the visitorship, we want to see how we can have a better evaluation of the impact on working with our whole stakeholders, how to measure the whole diversity and the whole museum-going culture, and the bigger impact on the sort of social cohesion and the mental well-being. So these are very, very challenging, very difficult area, but I think we have to make a start. And take, for example, on the mental well-being with our aging population, we have actually collaborated with quite a number of healthcare providers and quite a lot of social organizations on, say, dementia program. And we do have also a specific research project to track the outcome. So these are at a more micro level. So it'll be a combination of very specific projects as well as a whole more sector-wide impact.
Any specific thoughts on the subject of new success metrics? Honor?
Well, yeah, it's a $64 million question, isn't it? One of our KPIs before COVID-19 was international visitation. So that's a big zero right now. So obviously we have to, think about different KPIs. One of the things that we're doing now, this is just a practical observation, because I know we have a lot of museum professionals tuning in today, is that in our weekly kind of marketing comms and audience evaluation meetings, we now look at our on-site visitation and our online visitation directly alongside one another. And we've spent the last few weeks trying to get a really good methodology for counting kind of online visitors, which isn't, the number of people who visited our web pages. It's people who have actually engaged and sat with our kind of online programs, so that we can try and start getting a sense of a kind of like for like kind of measure of visitation. And as the programs moving forward, we can start getting a sense of kind of where the growth and the fluctuations are in the online visitation versus the on-site visitation. Right now, the online visitation is higher than the on-site visitation, because if you reduce your on-site visitation by 89%, that means your on-site is fairly small. And that puts a lot of pressure, I think, on us ensuring that we're engaging with visitors online meaningfully, not just, kind of serving them bite-sized packages of content, but actually having meaningful encounters. So that's one way to really, kind of up the importance of online visitation as a new KPI. But as Ms Chang has said very eloquently, the other area that all museums now, I think, need to be thinking of is how we perhaps measure our more qualitative kind of social mental health impacts on our visitors, because our value right now goes far beyond the number of people we're engaging. Our value is about how we're engaging with people, what kinds of stories we're telling, how we're helping people kind of navigate the uncertainty and the trauma of the pandemic, how we're able to use our staff of extremely caring, deeply passionate kind of people to provide care for the community. That feels like a really important role for a cultural institution right now, and how we consider that as being, you know, a key performance indicator, I think is a big question going forward.
Dr. Yang?
说一下上海博物馆的情况。上海博物馆呢，在以往正常的情况下面，也是要限流的。我们一天上限是8000个观众，所以往往呢，我们到下午2点到3点的时候呢，我们就会对那些在排队的观众进行劝告提醒，说我们人数已经满了，你们不要再排队了。那么疫情发生以后呢，我们就进一步的采取了限流。刚恢复开放的时候呢，我们是2000个预约名额，是要求在网上预约，然后你现场你出示你的预约码，你才能够进馆。那么2000这个数字呢，是希望观众在展厅里面人流不要过多，更不要发生聚集的情况。所以呢，我们这个展厅的介绍，在3、4月份的时候，我们也已经停下来了。目的就是说，人不要围在一起，避免交叉感染。那么最近，疫情继续好转，我们现在把参观的人数一天是限在3200个，3200个，也是要通过网上预约的。那么3200个呢，在展厅里面呢，也是提醒观众，你人不要往一块聚，尽量的大家分散，而且你还要全程的戴着口罩。那么因为人群不能聚集，所以呢，现在从参观的舒适度来讲，现在是参观博物馆最好的时机。你可以在博物馆有一个非常好的一个氛围，你一个人可以很安静的在那里观赏一件文物，不受其他的干扰。接下去我们会随着疫情的进一步的好转，我们还会再把人数再会放宽。这是我们的做法。那么从上海博物馆往年的情况来看呢，因为每天是限在8000，所以一年的观众人数大概是在200万左右。我们人数最多的那一年，我记得是210万多一点。那么有的时候呢是在190万多一点，总在200万上下。东莞建成以后，因为它的展陈面积增加了，公共活动的面积增加了，我们现在预估大概东莞未来前面几年大概可以每年接待观众在500万，这样500万左右加上我们这个馆的200万，就在700万左右。那么我们希望疫情能够尽早结束，让我们能够过上一个正常的一个博物馆的迎客、博物馆参观的这样的一个新的情况。
Yes, I think all that you've mentioned about the need to find the right metrics for meaningful online engagement, that's very important for all of us, because I think a lot of our digital content is long format. So we want to measure, the how meaningfully people have been engaged. And interestingly enough, I read an article about a museum in the US trying to measure social inclusiveness. So not just visitorship, but also including a social inclusiveness score as among its metrics. So on the subject of social inclusiveness, we've got some questions in this area. As we know, COVID has created a unique opportunity to rethink the focus of museums, and Honor mentioned specifically the need to respond to diverse voices. Globally, there have been concerted moves by many museums to respond to Black Lives Matter and post-colonial interpretations of history and collections. So the question is, how has the Shanghai Museum and NHB responded to some of these fundamental shifts towards responding to diverse voices? And related to that, also, there is a question on NHB's plans to connect with older adults, as well as groups with accessibility issues. Yeah, so just questions on diversity, accessibility, and older adults who might be left out by this, shift to technology. Okay, Ms. Chang.
Maybe I can just take the question on the elderly first. In fact, even before COVID, under our SG Heritage Plan, accessibility is one of the key pillars. We're working very hard to look at accessibility, both in terms of physical accessibility as well as programs. And we have done our audience analysis. Actually, the elderly has been very, very much underrepresented. It constitutes nearly 20% of our population, but less than 6% of our visitorship. So this one area that we have already identified that we really want to do more. And unfortunately, we also know now that the elderly is the more vulnerable to the COVID. But fortunately, we have, even before COVID, put in place some of the online activities. Take, for example, we have already resumed our virtual return to tea dance. And we also have this robot date. So we have resumed some of these activities. But for fiscal, we have to take reference from the broader national recovery plans. But it's certainly one area that we are very concerned about. And in fact, for NMS, we are actually revamping the entire gallery 10 to cater for the elderly population. And actually, we are in the midst of conducting workshop sessions for our volunteers. Unfortunately, it's been disrupted in some way, but we hope to resume them as soon as possible. In terms of the diversity, yes, we are very mindful that this pandemic has really exposed a lot of the underbelly of the society, has brought to fore the marginalized community, but it has not offered us any solution. It has exposed problem, but it has not offered any solutions. It's really up to us to see how we can do so. So I mentioned about some of the modifications, some of the adjustment of the changes to the exhibition calendaring. So for NMS, we have really put a lot of emphasis now on contemporary collecting to really capture the moment. Look at what are the significant events, and to also modify our mode of public engagement. So I'll see that this is a very important area where we want to really engage the different diverse communities to come together to have very meaningful dialogue, both hopefully online as well as offline. So this one very specific area. So we are, akan datang, we will be sharing more information, but we'll have a contemporary sort of exhibition in the beginning of the year, and also be something that's more focusing on COVID, the pandemic, all the challenges that you have presented, all the opportunities presented, the resilience that we've displayed, and the whole host of issues that is thrown up later on in 2021. And I really welcome also the feedback and suggestion on how we can do it in the most impactful and meaningful way.
Dr. Yang?
对于年长的那部分观众呢，我们也有考虑。比如说，现在我们博物馆尽管参观都是要在网上预约。那么对年长的部分观众来讲呢，他们要使用这个手机啊来预约啊，他们可能会有困难。所以呢，我们在现场为这样一些人提供了一个便捷通道，就是你到了博物馆门口，你没有预约，我们有这个志愿者，来帮你或者教你怎么用手机来预约。这个需求量还是蛮多的，因为老年人现在看到手机的使用、网络的使用，他们会有一种能力的欠缺，更严重的有些会觉得很胆怯，所以呢，我们给了一个绿色通道，欢迎你到博物馆来，我们给你帮助，然后在现场预约以后， 和网上预约一样，你都可以进入博物馆。这是我们解决一些年长的也就是比较弱势的能力比较弱势的老人的采取的一个办法。那么进入馆以后呢，我们也针对一些年长的老人提供了一些特殊的服务。如果他行动不太方便的，我们都有轮椅提供，让他们可以坐着轮椅来观展，也是有考虑的。
Dr. Yang, what about the the issue of making room for diverse voices, which some international museums have been reviewing, and I think Honor mentioned it as well. How has the Shanghai Museum, I mean, any thoughts or reflections in this area?
好的，我前面提到过，7月15号，上海博物馆呢，组织了一场国际博物馆人云上对话，有8个国家和地区的这个馆长和专家参与的这个讨论。这个经过这一次对话呢，我发现这个欧美的博物馆的一些馆长，他们的担心可能要比中国国内的担心要多，因为现在欧美的一些地区，他们遭受的疫情，从目前来看更加的严重。他们估计，这一波之后，很多博物馆临时关闭，然后呢再次开放。最初是估计大概有12%的博物馆可能不能开放了。那么最新的估计是昨天的估计，说有1/3的博物馆不能开放的。另外，我也听到了很多博物馆，欧美博物馆的馆长，他们正在裁员或者减少这个薪酬，也就是说，博物馆支付的能力在降低，所以这个是一个巨大的挑战。我个人的感觉，欧美博物馆遇到的情况，至少要比现在新加坡和中国遇到的问题要更多。但是大家都对未来还是充满了信心。有几位馆长都提到了，是一个有信心的未来。所以我觉得呢，通过像我们今天这样的一个线上的一个论坛，大家重新树立信心，在今天是非常的重要。那么在线上交流的时候，也有馆长提出了，在今天这样一个国际交流受到比较大的冲击的情况下面，我们博物馆要更多的去关注、挖掘自身的藏品，就是说你要加强对自身藏品的研究和利用。因为之前是可以通过博物馆之间的交流来合作办展，办很多大家都很喜欢的展览，但是国际交流现在面临着不确定性，那我们就要更多的考虑运用自身的藏品来办展览，所以这是一个比较重要的一个迹象，就是说要加强我们馆员对自身的收藏、自身历史的了解，尽可能的把我们藏品的优势发挥出来。这样，如果还是疫情反复，大家不能来往，我们博物馆还是可以办展览的。因为对博物馆来讲，我是非常同意刚才那个哈格尔馆长和张局长提到的，这个线上线下是相辅相成的。那么从博物馆的本质的存在意义来讲，更多的是应该发挥它线下的意义，就是说观众到博物馆来看是要看现场，他要有一个现场的一个感受，线上是一个补充或者一个拓展。那么在这种情况下面，你要办展览，你要不受疫情的影响，你就必须把自己的馆藏好好的挖掘，好好的呈现出来。所以疫情给了我们一个提醒，我们要充分的珍惜自身的博物馆的收藏。
If I may ask, Honor too, because there's quite a lot of interest in this question on older audiences. How does the Art Science Museum ensure the balance of engaging the younger audience yet not alienating the older audience who are not as digitally savvy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when the museum was closed, that was tricky, obviously, because we didn't have a site to welcome our visitors to. But we have made a very strong effort, I think, through the online program to think through the communities who have frankly always been marginalised in our society, but perhaps those issues are becoming a little bit more obvious and pressing now. And this is one of the reasons why we did a whole program last week as part of our Let's Talk About series that specifically focused on elderly people in our community. It had a special guest appearance from Yai, the grandmother of one of our staff members, Dina, who's 91. And spoke about some of the, kind of the challenges that he faces. And actually hearing from our local community and putting our local elder community and putting them in the program, I think is one way that museums like ours can address the issue of, how we ensure that we're not, I guess, alienating members of the community who feel less confident with technology.
Thank you. So there's a question which I think is very relevant to that of museum professionals about how the pandemic necessitates very specific physical design responses to galleries and exhibitions, zero-touch interactives, etc., which will require fundamental rethinking of exhibition and permanent gallery design, as well as interactive programs like performance installations and kits interactives. So how do your museums plan to respond to these challenges?
Yeah, I think this will also spark innovation. I think there are now different innovation in terms of contactless interactive through motion, through RFID. So I think when there's a challenge, I think there will be innovation to respond to that. But of course, we have to take that into consideration even right at the design stage. So actually, we are facing that right now for our coming exhibition on Home Truly, and the team has given a lot of thought on how to still ensure the interactivity but without contact. So I think it's possible to do that. It's more challenging, but it's possible. And right now, as you're also probably aware, that we are repositioning the Teletalim Museum as a dedicated children museum, and it's getting nightmare to my team. As we know, for Children Museum, we want it to be as interactive, as immersive as possible. So how do we continue to do so, in this environment? And it's a challenge, but thankfully we have another, 9 months to go, and it's almost having to start from fresh, looking at that and see how do we. But I think interactivity, while it's very important, content, is the storytelling, the narrative. I think we should take it as a challenge that we should not just hide behind the technology. Technology is an enabler. It sort of helps us to tell our stories, but importantly, it has to be very compelling, and we have to be very, very clear about what is the objective, what is the message, what is the thing that we want to convey. I think if we have clarity on that, the rest is really the technical details. How do we do it as in an impactful way as possible? And I'm quite optimistic because there's a lot of innovation in adversity. Just look at even this COVID, there's so many innovation that's come to the fore. So I think we'll want to take it one step at a time, and actually, not just in terms of the audience engagement. I think for us, we have about 4 or 5 museums that are under renovation now. And it really has presented us with a good opportunity, not just for audience engagement, but also for ops. Take, for example, the whole building management. We want to put in place smart CCTV, environmental sensing, fault reporting, and so that our staff can provide more value-add services. And just now, I think there was one question raised about the big technology company. I think we have decided to take a different approach. Actually, we also take this opportunity to co-create with the tech industry. So we have actually engaged a startup, a local SME, to co-create with our team on the whole IT in terms of ticketing, digital concierge, chatbot, content push, in terms of electronic transaction e-commerce. Of course, China is way, way ahead, and we are trying to learn as much as possible. But we want to take the approach of co-creating and learning together, so that we can sort of rise up to that kind of challenge. Yeah.
Honorable Dr. Zhigang.
刚才那个主持人问到了这个对于弱势群体，我们有没有一些什么做法？包括未来的观众有没有可能触摸到我们的产品？我举一个例子，这是去年我们举办的一个展览，是和法国凯布朗利博物馆合作的一个展览，展示的是这个太平洋岛民的这个艺术品。那么在这个展览里面呢，我们就特地的考虑到了那些视力有问题的那些弱势群体，就是盲人。我们在展厅里面专门有一个角落，是复制了一些展品各种各样的这个艺术品，然后这些展品放在那边呢，是可以有盲人去触摸的。我们还配备了盲文。这个做一个说明，这些盲文说明呢，就是盲人你可以去阅读这个盲文，然后进一步了解这个产品的它的含义，所以可以通过触摸，通过读盲文来帮助一个盲人这样一个特殊群体能够进入博物馆，克服他们的障碍，能够接触到博物馆的这样的一个传播的一种，这是我们去做的一个尝试，这样一个尝试呢，我们觉得在今后还会继续下去。我们会选择合适的主题，选择合适的展品，我们来推动我们的这种向弱势群体的一种倾斜。这是我想是博物馆要发挥它的共享的这样的一种核心价值观的，应该要去推进的一个方面。
Yeah, Honor? Maybe to return to the topic of exhibition design and how to make it, safer in this pandemic.
So this is obviously an issue that all museums are facing right now. We're building a exhibition that opens next month, and so we had to go back to the drawing board with the design of the show and change the spatial layout of the exhibition to account for safe distancing, and also rethink the interactivity in the exhibition using some quite novel ways. One of our very talented education staff came up with a mode of physical interaction using feet instead of hands, which may or may not make it into the final version of the show. I think it's important also to make the point that the pandemic doesn't eliminate the possibility of doing interactive and immersive work within an exhibition. It just changes the way that it's done. There's a much greater focus on health and safety and staffing at the sites of interaction, which means ensuring that there's hand sanitizer available for all visitors who are going to touch something before and after, that gloves are made available to visitors every time there's a touch point, and that the gloves are disposed of safely after each use. So interaction isn't impossible within exhibitions. It just requires a lot of resources and a lot of staff. And going forward, whether or not that kind of highly staff-intensive approach to managing interaction, whether that's sustainable or not, is a big question. The other thing I think it's important to kind of to highlight is that we don't know how the COVID-19 pandemic is going to play out in the mid to long term. So I think it's important that we don't make decisions today which cut off creative and audience engagement possibilities for the long term. The difficult thing about being a museum professional now, or a theatre professional, Clarissa, is operating in a contingent space where you have to have many different scenarios operating simultaneously. And you need to confidently plan for all of them, because all of them may come to pass. So for next year, we're continuing to plan for a program that might include international exhibitions, and at the same time plan for a future where international exhibitions are impossible, and you have to plan for both simultaneously. So the difficulty, I think, is making short-term alterations to exhibitions that are absolutely 100% focused on health and safety, because that's the #1 concern, but not necessarily shut options down for the long term, where the approach to the pandemic may shift at any time, either locally or internationally.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. So there is a question that I think is quite meaningful for all of us. So, you know, with all the restrictions on travel and crossing borders, invariably, you know, there'll be less blockbuster exhibitions, fewer international loans and collaborations. But at the same time, I mean, how do we balance it such that, you know, while it's great to focus on local communities, that it doesn't also lead to a narrow parochial and insular perspective? How do we, in this climate of closed borders, sort of try to recover and regain some of that expansive, mind-expanding nature of transnational programming?
I was hoping you would ask that question, because I think it's a really good one, and it actually dovetails into something that Dr. Yang was speaking about in his presentation. For collections-based museums, there is going to be a tendency, I think, now to focus on kind of the institution's collection. And that's the right thing to do. With large museums, only a tiny fraction of their collection will be on show kind of at any one time. But there are many museums, and ours is an example of this, that can't draw on a local collection. We're not collections-based institutions. And so therefore we need to think really carefully about what types of stories we might be telling at a time where borders remain closed or at least restricted. And I think the pivot towards telling local stories is actually deeply, deeply inspiring. And it creates a massive opportunity for kind of meaningful storytelling that perhaps, you know, we weren't alert to kind of before. That said, the question really carefully nails the potential kind of challenge with the pivot to local, which is the danger of a parochialism or an insularity kind of emerging. And that is a risk. And I think all of us as museum kind of professionals, as curators and as leaders of institution need to be really alert to that possibility, and try and think about how, as Dr. Yang has highlighted multiple times actually during his presentation, we continue to put international cooperation at the forefront of what we do, despite, you know, kind of the challenges of being able to physically travel kind of ourselves or have our objects physically travel. We've all seen, I think, that international discussion at a time such as this is not only possible, it's been made more frequent because of lockdown. We've made time kind of in our busy schedules to talk to each other, to talk to our international counterparts in ways that we might not have done before. So I certainly think it's possible to think about how international cooperation becomes a key part of our curatorial strategies going forward, whilst thinking about how local stories become a bigger part of our offer. The trick is balance. Hopefully those of us who work as creative storytellers and curators can pull off that balance.
Ms. Chang?
I absolutely agree that telling compelling story of our permanent collection, of our local collection, is not mutually exclusive, and it really complements with the international cooperation. And as I mentioned, I really look forward to our international travel of our shipwreck to Shanghai Museum. It was starting in September, and we are still sort of looking forward to this collaboration with Beijing Palace Museum as well for the Ming exhibition in the end of the year. So we really hope that they will still put it through. But of course, we will have to make some adjustment for some other international collaboration in terms of timing, in terms of the scale. But I absolutely agree that it's very important to maintain the kind of balance because it's an opportunity to bring the world. Not every Singaporean will have the opportunity to travel abroad, and it's really we see it as our responsibility to also to bring the world to the people. So it's a question of how we can balance it and do it well. And also coming back to Order's point about being very nimble and agile, I think that's really the key. And it's not really the survival of the strongest. I think it's the survival of the most agile and the most nimble. And we really have to entertain all the different scenarios and be mentally very, very quick to adapt to whatever situation that may come about. But of course, right at the outset, I think we have to develop a plan that's as robust as possible. We're now already planning for the night festival next year. Would it be another totally digital edition? Or again, would it be a combination of both? But we have to be mentally prepared, and so that come what may, we will still be able to pull it through in the best way that we can, and in a very compressed time, because the situation can be very volatile. And I think that's a challenge for all the museum professionals, and we just have to gear ourselves up for that, and hopefully with a kind of partnership across the whole community as well as international partner, we will be able to do it well.
Dr. Yang?
局长讲的，只有灵活的人才能生存。我举一个例子，这个几年我们上海博物馆啊和新加坡亚洲文明博物馆一直在推进我们的合作。我们要在今年要办一个黑石号的这个沉船出水文物的一个展览。那么原定的计划是今年4月份要开幕的，结果呢，因为这个疫情就推到了5月份，5月份呢又推到了7月份，现在又推到了9月份啊，所以我们很灵活因为灵活，所以我们不断的调整计划。那么现在我们双方的合作非常的好，大家都非常的默契我们共同找到了一个现在旅行很困难的一个情况下，能够让新加坡亚洲文明博物馆的文物运到上海的一个方案，就是我们要借助中国和新加坡之间有一个叫绿色通道这是针对少数商务活动和其他教育文化活动专门开辟的一个通道。那么我们要用好这个通道，设计出一个对于疫情防控闭环的一个管理的一个方法。现在我们看来有可能我们9月份是可以开幕的，所以我们现在很期待在疫情最困难的情况下面，上海和新加坡合作办一个有国际影响的展览，这样我们就能够显示我们的博物馆的力量。就是说线上的活动是重要的，但是线下的活动更能够体现博物馆的本质，所以一定要线上和线下结合。那么我们也在想了，开幕式肯定是有线下的开幕，但是呢，还有很多新加坡的领导和朋友不能到上海博物馆，那么我们就要通过线上的连线来共同完成一个开幕式。所以呢，我们 既欢迎张局长和其他的领导和朋友来上海博物馆出席开幕式。如果不方便，我们也可以在开幕式上面通过连线，我们一起来共享盛举。所以在这样的一个时刻，我觉得我们国际博物馆界要多多合作，守望相助，这是我们唯一的一个出路。
谢谢。Thank you to all of you. So I think that's really been the subtext of today's discussion, the nimble museum, the agile museum, from really fully coming to grips with digital as a medium, a unique medium on its own for storytelling, trying to come up with meaningful metrics, to put alongside visitorship, rethinking what it means to design safer exhibition spaces in the context of the shifting guidelines of this pandemic. And above all, rethinking the role of the museum in today's context, how it can give a platform for diverse voices, how it can pivot back to local communities while also continuing, to reach out to international partners. And, really we are only limited by our imaginations, I think, in this scenario. So I thank all of you for staying with us, for all your questions. And I thank all our speakers. I wish you all the best. And thank you and have a good lunch.
Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your questions. I think you will agree that it's been a very engaging session this morning. We would like to take this opportunity to also thank our speakers and moderator for their insights and their sharing today. It's indeed a challenging time for all of us during this period, but you can see that the pandemic has really accelerated digitalization and also innovation in various forms, and we have many digital offerings for people to access. So there may be challenges as we adapt to the new normal, but we will all emerge stronger and resilient. We have come to the end of today's webinar. Before you leave the session, we would appreciate if you could provide us with your feedback for today's webinar, please. So you may access the feedback form via the link or scan the QR code as shown on the screen. And if you would like to find out more about the Culture Academy's programs, please visit cultureacademy.sg, and you may check out our past events and resources that may interest you. All right, thank you for joining us today, and stay tuned for our next emailer for our next webinar. And in the meantime, take care, stay safe and healthy, and we wish you a great weekend ahead.